free shows coming up here on the God's Truth, so make sure that you're subscribing, make sure you're liking, make sure you're doing everything you need to do to stand with the God's Truth, and you don't miss out on any shows that are coming up here in the future. As I just said, we're going to be debating, does the mind show evidence of God? I have Stelman Smith Jr. with me. If you know him, he's from the platform Unapologetic Apologist. So check him out. He has a great channel. Make sure you, when you go over there, you subscribe to him. And I also have Danny from Field Talk. He's an up and coming. He's using on Cord. I think it's on Cord he's on. And but he has a page, and I would like for you guys to go check these guys out. But I'm gonna let these guys come in and introduce themselves to you. No need for me to talk to you about them if they could talk about themselves. What's going on, fellas? How y'all doing?
Just fine.
Great,
Thanks
man.
for having me.
Well, I'm glad you guys are jumping on this one, man. This is going to be a great topic, great debate. And so before we jump into this, let me allow you guys to introduce yourselves. I sort of gave a little quick run through your platform, but if you have anything else you guys do, blogs, websites, whatever you do, make sure you tell these guys what you do. All right. So start with Danny. If you don't mind, give a quick introduction to yourself, man.
Yeah, I'm Danny. I have this new channel since January called Phil Talk, and I post some of my debates, and I have a couple interviews. I'm really interested in philosophy, so if you like that sort of stuff, and if you like debates and I guess debate reviews, I do some of those, then you should check out that page. But that's all I got for my intro.
All right, thank you, Danny. Appreciate you. All right, Stillman, go ahead and give a quick introduction to yourself, man.
Sure, yeah. My name is Stelman Smith Jr. Me and my buddy a couple years ago founded the Unapologetic Apologist just because we wanted to, have the opportunity to talk to some of the thinkers we admire, like Frank Turek or William Lane Craig. And I've been really, really grateful and blessed over the years to have some of those guys come on my show and talk with me about some, ideas, stuff I'm interested in. And I don't know what else to say. But thank you for the invitation, having me on. I will say it's been really great over the past couple weeks getting to know Danny. Him and I have talked a couple times, so I'm definitely really looking forward to this conversation. And if I may add, it is my good friend Mark's birthday today, so I want to say happy birthday to Mark.
All right, cool. Happy birthday, Mark, man. Hope hope you ain't getting like me, man, with the salt and pepper on your face, man. Getting that age, man. But good stuff, man. All right, so we're gonna jump into this, man. We ain't gonna waste no more time. Once again, the topic of this debate: does the mind show evidence of the existence of God? Danny, you're arguing a negative. Stillman, you're arguing affirmative. So we're gonna start this off with 20-minute opening statements. We're gonna follow that with 5-minute rebuttals. Then we're gonna have about a 40-minute open discussion. The only time I'll jump in is if I feel you guys are throwing that homonyms or being rude to each other or veering off topic. Then we're going to follow that with 5-minute closings, and then we're going to have some Q&A from the audience. Sounds good?
Sounds great.
Sounds good to me.
All right, Stillman, you're up first for your 20-minute opening. Let me know when you're ready, and I will start your time. Oh,
sure, you're ready. I'm going to start.
All right, speaking of time, when your 1-minute warning is coming up, you both will hear this little chime. You hear that little ding that lets you know you have 1 minute left in your opening statement or rebuttal or closing. So make sure you use your time wisely. You'll also see the time up in your upper left-hand corner of your screen. So whenever you can glance up there just to get a quick reference of that time. Let me know when you're ready, and I'll start your time, Stillman.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, you got it for 20 minutes.
All right, so first I want to thank Marlon for inviting me on. I really appreciate it, and thank you, Danny, for engaging in this debate. The question of the debate is, does the mind show evidence for the existence of God? Now, to begin addressing this topic, I want to read from Josh Rasmussen's book, How Reason Can Lead to God. In his chapter, Foundation of Minds, he writes on page 76, "A world with minds. What sort of being are you? Here's a clue. You are capable of thinking, feeling, and making decisions. In other words, you have a conscious mind. Minds are strange. Why do any minds exist? We can easily imagine a world without minds. For example, imagine a world that has all the shapes and structures of our universe, except with no emotions, no thoughts, no hopes, and no feelings. Or imagine an evolutionary process that spawns an army of machines shaped nearly like us, yet without any consciousness. Yet our world manifestly includes conscious minds. How? Why? Throughout recorded history, people have provided precisely two fundamentally different accounts of the origin of minds. First, There's the foundational mind hypothesis. According to this hypothesis, mental reality is foundational to the rest of reality. The other account of minds is materialism. On this hypothesis, the foundation is mindless. Given materialism, people, assuming they exist, are the product of a complex pattern of particles and nothing more. If materialism is true, then reality proceeds from shapes to sensations, from motions to mind, and from particles to people. Now, a quick note before I make my argument. I'm aware that my opponent is not a materialist or a naturalist, so my intention is not to saddle him with a position he does not hold. I am not naively assuming a false dichotomy between theism and materialism. However, I do think there is a dichotomy between mind at the foundation and any non-mind hypothesis. I am here not only for my opponent, but for you, the audience. And because I believe many of you who are atheists are also naturalists, my argument will address naturalism as an example of a non-mind hypothesis. That will be stage 1 of my argument, and my opponent, I believe, will agree with stage 1. In stage 2, I'll address other non-mind hypotheses and show that they will have the same exact problem in explaining minds. Now for stage 1. I will be defending the foundational mind hypothesis. That is, that reality at its foundation is a mind, and this provides the best explanation for why any minds exist. In order to do this, I'm going to focus on 3 attributes of minds or consciousness, and then show why theism better explains these facts than naturalism. The first is qualia. Qualia are the feeling aspects of certain sensations. An itch feels a certain way. Happiness feels a certain way. This feeling is what philosophers call quali, which is the singular of qualia. It is what makes an emotion different from mere motion. It also provides a distinction between what we might call third-person characteristics with first-person characteristics. First-person characteristics are qualia like anger, hunger, or pain. We've discussed them. But third-person characteristics are things like shape, size, motion, and mass. A mug, for example, has third-person characteristics. It has shape, weight, and size, but it has no first-person experiences. Likewise, planets in motion have only third-person characteristics, their mass, occupation in space, motion in orbit. But a planet has no first-person experiences. The question, then, is how on materialism do minds come to be? If all that exists is nature, atoms, laws of physics, and physical materials, then how are minds constructed? This is known as the construction problem, or the hard problem of consciousness. To be clear, the construction problem is not guilty of a composition fallacy, because it is the case that certain constructions are impossible. Think about a few examples. It is impossible to construct a blue floor from only white tiles. It is impossible to construct a green window from only red bricks. It is impossible to construct a prime minister from only prime numbers, to use Josh's example. Consider sand. Sand has no first-person aspects, and if I were to pick up the sand and rearrange it in my hand, it would never gain first-person aspects by my constructing it a certain way. Once we have this common ground of understanding that some constructions are possible or not, we can then ask the question of whether or not it is possible to construct a mind from pure matter, and I'll argue that constructing a mind from pure matter is an impossible construction. Here's a question. Why would the motions of atoms in our brains give rise to consciousness? At this point, it's worth it to mention emergentism. One could say that unlike sand, given a certain chemical makeup, firing of neurons and brain activity, that consciousness emerges. But of course, this is to miss the problem. The problem is not whether or not certain organic life forms can exhibit a type of behavior. Rather, the problem is how to construct first-person sensations from merely third-person materials. Suppose we were to try and build a robot that had first-person experience. How could we possibly do that? Sure, we could build a robot that behaved as if it had first-person sensations. For example, we could build a robot that scratched its leg or smiled. But that would not be the same thing as building a robot that actually had experiences of an itch or happiness. So the question is not if a certain mechanical construction can give rise to a robot that exhibits certain behaviors, nor is the question whether or not the evolutionary process can give rise to certain motions of atoms in a brain that cause organic beings to carry out certain activities. But the question is how to construct first-person experiences from only third-person aspects of reality. Furthermore, the proposal of emergentism doesn't solve the problem. It just labels it. Suppose we saw water pouring from a rock. How is that possible? Here's an answer. The water emerges from the rock. But if I were to give you that answer, you would say to me, that doesn't answer the question. How does the water emerge from the rock? Simply saying that consciousness emerges from the brain merely labels the mystery. It does not solve it. Clearly, there is something else at play beyond the rock and the water, and there is clearly something more at play than the brain and consciousness. Number 2 is private access. This is the second attribute of consciousness, that your consciousness is directly knowable by you. You have direct access to your feelings and sensations that are unique to you. No one else has this kind of direct access to your own awareness of your consciousness. Others can only make inferences to them based on your outward behavior. If someone sees you smile, they can infer that you are happy based on the third-person characteristics that they are seeing. But you don't infer that you are happy. Your feeling of happiness is directly knowable by you. You're immediately aware of it. No inference necessary. So here we see the construction problem again. How is it possible to construct private aspects of reality from purely public aspects of reality? Much like building the robot, we have access to all sorts of public aspects like metals, wires, electrical circuits, and software. But these are public and equally available to everyone, and we intuitively recognize that no combination of these things could give rise to a brand new private aspect of reality in the consciousness of the robot. Now, one may object that this construction problem has already been solved by neuroscience. What I refer to as a private aspect of direct awareness to an itch or happiness, for example, has already been proven to correlate with brain activity. Neuroscientists look at brain activity and they can infer you have an itch. They can observe different brain activity and infer that you feel happy. But remember what I pointed out earlier. This inference is based on third-person characteristics. It's based on third-person characteristics like gray matter and so on, and it's not the same thing as your first-person awareness of it. In fact, the only way neuroscientists were able to map out the connection in the first place was to ask the patients in the experiments how they were feeling. They couldn't know just by observing the brain activity. So I want to be clear about what the construction problem is. It is not whether brain activity causes consciousness. Obviously, brain activity does have causal effects on consciousness, just as the mind has causal effects on the brain. The problem then is the nature of the connection. How does certain brain activity connect with private aspects of an itch? Merely seeing the connection does not explain what makes the connection possible, just like the water coming from the rock. Number 3 is free will. A third attribute of consciousness is your power to make free choices. Can you make free choices? Some would argue no, but I want to appeal to your intuition of yourself making choices. Every day we wake up and face a landscape of potential. What we will eat for breakfast, what time we will leave for work, and an uncountable amount of details in between. We make those potentials reality with our free choices. We could have chosen something else. You could have chosen oatmeal instead of cereal. You could have slept in 10 minutes later and told your boss that bad traffic was the reason you were late for work. We are creatures that make millions of choices every single day, and your choices are up to you. Now let's give the devil its due. Perhaps this is just an illusion. It's not as though we can actually know whether or not we could have made different choices because traveling back in time is impossible. But let's leave aside what is known as the principle of alternative possibilities. The point I want to make here is that our senses are our windows into reality. Your sense of sight of tables and clocks is a window into a reality of a world with tables and clocks. Your sense of smell is a window into a reality with foods and other things that give off smells. And I submit that your sense of yourself making choices is a window into a reality of a world where you really do make genuine choices. But if this is true, we once again run into a construction problem. How do we construct minds that make choices from natural materials that don't have the power to make choices? The laws of physics don't make choices. Atoms don't make choices. The evolutionary process did not make choices as it just followed the physics of our universe. And functions in your brain don't make choices because they result from the motions of atoms that don't make choices following the laws of physics that didn't make choices. And so if your mind is the product of this unguided process, how does the ability to choose just emerge? It seems to me that it would be impossible. And so on the naturalistic framework, you don't make genuine choices, but rather you are pulled along by the physics of the universe in a mindless and unguided way. You are not free. Dr. Braxton Hunter puts it this way: if materialism is true, we are in a closed system of cause and effect. The universe is like a machine creating little machines. So, looking at the 3 attributes of mind discussed, qualia, private access, and the power to choose, we have a clear construction problem on naturalism, or any non-mind hypothesis. Third-person, public, and mindless aspects are the wrong materials for building first-person, private minds that have the power to make choices. Now I will briefly present stage 2 of my argument, in which I provide a solution to the problem, the foundational mind hypothesis. And once again, I want to turn to Josh Rasmussen's book, How Reason Can Lead to God. He writes on pages 89 and 90, first, if mentality exists at the foundational layer of reality, then this foundation could be the ultimate cause of the first-person sense that minds have. The foundation would itself include a first-person sense. Instead of shifting from pure nonsense to sense, sense exists at the foundation of things. Thus, the foundational mind could construct first-person properties from first-person sense properties. Sense materials are then the ultimate building materials for all sensations. Second, the foundational mental layer would include the resources to produce minds that possess the power of private access. The foundational mind would have that same power. It would have the power to access its or their own thoughts and intentions directly. Thus, the foundational mental reality could create other minds that have the power of direct access to their own thoughts and intentions. Third, foundational mentality would include the resources to build beings that have the power to make choices. Here's how. Suppose the foundation forms laws of motion that leave some options open for other minds. As physicists tell us, not all physical laws are completely deterministic. A particle may go one way or another. Particles leave options open. With some options open, the foundation could then intentionally form beings with the power to make choices within some of the open options. In this case, particles do not completely pull people along. Power can flow the other way. People have the power to pull particles along within the options open. So, with this in mind, it seems we have an argument that the existence of our minds cries out for an explanation which can be found in a foundational mind. If we start with a foundational mind as our hypothesis, then we have both the resources and the predictive ability to construct minds. This foundational mind would have the intentionality required to create other minds. It would possess the power and intelligence to fine-tune a universe in which those minds could exist. It would have the mental attributes needed to impart onto those minds, and so serves as an explanation for why and how our minds exist. And in the absence of a superior explanation, we are justified in reasoning that this foundational mind is indeed the best explanation. The burden of proof would then be on my opponent to provide us with a better explanation for the existence of our minds than the foundational mind hypothesis. What this foundational mind would then be is the most fundamental layer of reality. That is because if there is something more fundamental than this mind, then this mind would be just as unexplained as ours, and it wouldn't answer the construction problem since this mind would still not be explained in how it is constructed. And if this mind can't be constructed, then none of our minds could be constructed either, because we are dependent on this mind for the construction of our minds. Further, this foundational mind must be necessary. That's it cannot come into or go out of existence. Because if it could, there would be required something more fundamental to construct it. Since this mind is foundational, it is above the realm of possibility, and so it cannot go out of existence. Therefore, this foundational mind must be eternal. Lastly, if this mind is necessary, it cannot possess any arbitrary limits, and those limits would need an explanation from something more foundational. But as we've discussed, there is nothing more foundational. So this mind cannot be limited in knowledge or power. Therefore, it must contain all possible knowledge and all possible power. And a mind that is foundational, necessary, eternal, all-powerful, and all-knowing is what we mean when we say God. Therefore, if our minds exist, it follows that God exists. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Stelman, for that opening statement. All right, Danny, you're up for your 20th opening. Let me know when you're ready, and I'll start your time.
Okay, it's gonna. I'm ready. You may start the time.
All right, you got it.
Yeah, it's gonna be hard to not orient my opening towards what Stelman has a lot of what Stelman has said. So I'm not gonna be able to help myself here. But I first of all, a lot of what Stelman says I completely agree with. The first person, third person distinction. I think that there can't, in principle, be a scientific account or a theory of the mind. I think I'm a dualist, right? Meaning that I do distinguish mind and body as two separate ontological categories, right? A lot of what Stelman was saying was arguing for this sort of position, and I'm in complete agreement. So we can affirm dualism, no problem. Okay, so the topic of debate, though, is if dualism is true, does that constitute evidence for God? Okay. I think not. And there are a couple controls of evidence, but I take evidence to be something confirmatory, meaning that if we didn't see evidence for something, then it would be disconfirmatory. Okay, so very quick example. If I wanted to know whether there is a horse in my bathroom, okay, evidence of that would be some kind of animal with a set of organs that's furry and that goes nah with hooves. And the point is that I can generate those predictions from the proposition there's a horse in my bathroom, and then go in, and if that expectation is not met, the proposition is disconfirmed. It's falsified. Okay. So in virtue of not seeing those sorts of things, that's to say, the fur, the body, the hooves, that's all evidence that the fact that there's just a horse there, right? If I don't see that, then it sort of negates, or it falsifies the sort of hypothesis or proposition I'm entertaining. Okay. But I take theism, especially the sort of brand that Stelman's form of theism, Christian monotheism, to be to have a certain construal of God, that God is necessary and unfalsifiable. Okay. So the notion of an unfalsifiable thing, right, means that you can't use empirical data evidence, right, to show it to be false. Okay. Now, let me just grant, I think the argument that I'm making here could be made from a Christian, right? My atheism really doesn't matter right now, because a lot of theists think that, well, I think God is one of those things that a priori, meaning before experiences, before empirical data. You just kind of come to know God either through arguments or through the Holy Spirit or through intuition, right? That witnessing how the world is, like, the fact that leaves are green, and that there's DNA, that none of that is going to be evidence for God, because everything is consistent with the God hypothesis. So let me elaborate on what I mean by that. Okay. The idea is that people that want to say, let's just use a very simple example. People that want to say that because trees exist, therefore God exists, or that's to say that they take trees to be evidence for God. Well, on my view, that would mean that if there were no trees, there'd be no God. It would be disconfirmatory, right? But obviously that seems very false. It seems like God could have made a world, right, where there are no trees, or you could have a world where there are no trees and you would still think God exists, okay? In the same way, if you take a world in which there are no minds, right, I don't see how that falsifies the God. I think the God could exist in a world where there are no minds, okay? So that's to say that the existence of minds doesn't confirm the God hypothesis, nor does the non-existence of minds disconfirm the God hypothesis, okay? So a lot of what I'm going to say is repetitive, because honestly, this is not easy stuff. This is like deep philosophy, and people tend to get lost. It took me a long time to kind of get through the terms and the jargon. So to kind of reiterate, to summarize, the idea is that no empirical data, right, no truth that can be in principle observed or known via experience can prove or disprove God. That if you are going to claim that you have knowledge of God, it's going to be known via other ways, via an intuition. You could appeal to stuff like other metaphysical postulates, like the Holy Spirit, or philosophical argumentation. Okay. So that's to say that I take God to be a metaphysical thesis, in the sense that it's consistent with any kind of experiential state that you might have of the world outside of your internal states. Okay. Now, to more directly address what Stelman was saying about, I have a choice, right? They're minds. We want an account for why they're minds. And I already said that based on auxiliary fancy philosophical argumentation that I don't need to bring up, I don't think there can be a scientific theory of why my body has a mind. I don't think there can be a unified theory of that. Okay. I grant you that. I think that I'm convinced of that. Right. But he's saying that nonetheless, we must have an explanation, and either you're going to have a non-God world or God world to explain minds. Right. And then he gave a series of arguments that suggested that it can't be that a material thing explains mentality. Okay. So I wanted to distinguish two sorts of explanations. I rejected a scientific unified theory. Okay. Although a material explanation is not identical to such a theory. So you can have no scientific explanation or theory, rather, I should say theory, for a set of phenomena, but you could still have a materialistic account of what happened, right? So, for instance, if I fell down the stairs and I broke my leg, I would explain that materialistically in terms of me falling down the stairs. That's what explains my breaking of the leg. Okay. But notice that there are no laws of falling downstairs and breaking legs, right? There's no natural laws that govern, exactly, the correlations between falling downstairs and breaking legs. That's all going to be reduced to laws of physics, right? I can eliminate terms like stairs and legs, and I can just talk in purely of fundamental particles and natural laws of physics. Okay, so what I'm saying is that there you can posit a material explanation without invoking a unified theory of falling downstairs, right? So so we either have, that account. So I could say that, well, yeah, we have minds, and that's kind of explained by a certain set of physical states, but there's no theory about how that works. Or I can appeal to God as an explanation. Okay. And the first confusion that I have is that I think Stelman does agree that the physical interacts with the mental. Very simple example. If you drink alcohol, lots of it, hopefully you don't, when this is a good Christian channel, okay? Hopefully you don't, but if you do, your mental states are going to go all wacko, right? You're going to have different beliefs, qualitative experiences. There's all sorts of things going on with your mind. Now that can be sufficiently explained by your drinking of alcohol, okay? So there's a pretty simple example how the physical interacts with the mental. So to say that it's impossible, logically impossible, that the physical world could bring about a mind, I think that's too big of a burden to bear, because that would just rest on the view that the physical and the mental can't interact in such a way. And I didn't hear, and maybe I have to, in our conversation, he can elaborate, but I didn't hear an argument for why the physical and the mental can't interact in that particular way, right? But some other points of agreement with him, though, okay? I will agree that minds are strange, right? They're not, I don't take them to be material. I don't take them to be physical. Okay, so they're strange, although, it's like talking about, the number 3, and can I find the number 3 under a rock? Well, no, that's kind of silly. To me, I look at the number 3 that exists is immaterial, just as the mind is immaterial. So appealing to scientific data to establish one hypothesis over another, I agree with you, Stelman. We can't do that, okay? I also would agree that this notion of emergence has been a very elusive term for me. In the literature, in the philosophical literature, emergence is strongly tied with the notion of supervenience. And Stelman gave a pretty good example. You have H2O and the properties of water, and a lot of people want to say that the liquidity, the fact that the clearness of water supervenes on water's molecular structure, and that's kind of a notion of emergence, although it's not very well defined. In fact, it's so ill-defined that I don't even like to use the term with respect to philosophy of mind debate. So let me just then agree with you that if you're saying something like the mind emerges from the brain in the same way that the properties of water emerge from H2O, I agree with you, Stelman. That doesn't make any sense on my view. Okay. But I think that's pretty much the summary of my opener / response to what you said. But I guess that's it for me.
All right. Thank you so much, both, for all those opening statements. All right, Stelman, you're up for your 5-minute rebuttal. Let me know when you're ready. And let me reset this time real quick. And all right, let me know when you're ready, and I'll start your time.
Yeah, I'm ready.
All right, you got it, man.
All right, so thank you, Danny, for that. I really appreciate it. As you did, highlight our agreements. That you are a dualist as I am. That we don't think there can be. You said there can be a scientific explanation. I said naturalistic, and I hope you took my point seriously. That I wasn't trying to saddle you with naturalism. I think we agree that it's a good way of kind of setting the table for this kind of discussion. But I do think non-mind, the way I structured it, shows that any non-mind hypothesis has the same kind of problems. You talk about evidence as confirmatory, about making predictions if there's a horse in your bathroom, but I think, evidence for something, I don't take it to be merely confirmatory or based on predictions. I think evidence is just gives you reason to believe something. And so it could go backwards. If you walked into your bathroom and you found fur and you tested and it was horse fur and you saw, hoof prints, you could hypothesize that there was a horse present. So it doesn't merely have to be predictions. It can, you can infer to the best explanation. For whatever the reason that would be. You said God is unfalsifiable. Depends for pre-subs. God certainly is unfalsifiable. I wouldn't take that view. I'd take the view that if you could show a logical contradiction in his nature, you could falsify him that way. And then you had this other thing that kind of confused me. You said a world with no minds wouldn't disprove God. And then so the mirror image is that a world with minds can't prove God. But I don't see how that follows. Again, my argument is that a foundational mind is the best explanation for why any minds exist, that no minds could exist unless there was this foundational mind. And so I would say, if you have something like possible worlds but no God, I would say if there is no God, if there is no foundational mind, then in no possible world could minds exist of any kind. So the fact that minds exist in, even if it's only one of the possible worlds, I take that as evidence that there is a foundational mind, just like hoof prints I would take as evidence that there, was a horse. I wrote down here no theory about how the brain produces consciousness. I think that again might have been another point of agreement, that there's not really a theory of how brain produces consciousness. But then you went on to say the physical does interact with our minds, and you gave the example of alcohol. And I think you said I can't prove that the physical cannot produce minds. I think I gave an argument for why the construction of these attributes of mind would be impossible if you did not have these attributes of mind in the building blocks. And it's not merely, obviously I would grant that that our brains interacts with our minds, but there are examples of backwards causation where the mind has causal effects on the brain. And I don't think that would be the case if the entire explanation of our minds lied in the physical aspects of our brains. Firstly, I would point out that it's not merely brains, that there are cases that I can cite here of people with a condition, what is it called? I don't have the word written down, but there's cases of people born without brains and skulls just filled with fluid and they have consciousness. The placebo effect is an example. Multiple personality disorder is an example of how when different personalities manifest, they actually cause brain changes, like they can actually make the brain blind or make the body have allergic reactions. And then when different personalities manifest, those allergic reactions go away. And of course I agree that there is interaction going on, but I don't believe that the mind is just a necessary result of certain brain activity. Because if that was the case, mental causation to me wouldn't make any sense, right? If mind was completely dependent on brain, then any so-called mental causation would actually be the result of the brain. And so everything would be bottom up. You would never have any top-down examples. I'm not sure what else to cover there. So yeah, I might just leave it at that.
All right, sounds good. Thank you so much, Stelman. Appreciate you for your rebuttal. All right, Danny, you're up for your 5-minute rebuttal. Let me reset your time, and you can give it a go, man.
All right, so we should narrow in our disagreement because there are lots of points of agreement as well as there are lots of points of disagreement. So if we could just focus on what I think, sticking to the topic as you have been, we might be talking past each other as to what evidence is in the first place. Okay. Now, I do agree with you that there's basically two senses of evidence that I use, but that one is the one that I gave with respect to generating predictions. The horse example is such an example. Okay. And then there's this thing about this proposition compared to the other one, right? There is a horse in my bathroom versus there was a horse in my bathroom. Okay. Now the idea of there was a horse in my bathroom, that might not generate any predictions, because the idea is that if you go in your bathroom and it's squeaky clean with no hair, no animal, no nothing, right? Doesn't mean that the horse wasn't in your bathroom. It could have been that someone cleaned up after the horse's mess, right? So what's going on there is that if you were to think about whether there was a horse in your bathroom, you might expect, you're right, it does generate a prediction. You might expect that there might be hair or hoof prints, or, you gave some examples. But notice that if we didn't see those things, it wouldn't definitively falsify the fact that there was a horse in my bathroom, okay? Now, that sense of evidence relies on induction, okay? When I say there is a horse in my bathroom, that's not relying on induction. It's relying on my concept of horse, right? If I say there is a horse in my bathroom, I'm taking what I mean by horse, like hooves, body, warm-blooded, organs, friendly, whatever, okay, fur. That's my concept, and then I'm generating the predictions from my concept onto the real world as it is, okay? But with respect to the proposition there was a horse in my bathroom, okay, it's not going that way anymore. I can't rely on my concept of force to generate predictions to confirm or falsify that particular proposition, because it's in the past. So what I have to do is rely on my past experiences of horses and the mess they leave behind, right? In my experience, every time a horse goes around, it craps everywhere, right? So I might expect that there's, feces on my bathroom floor, right? So the idea is that I'm relying on prior experiences with the thing to generate those predictions rather than the meanings of or the concept in the proposition horse. Okay. So the idea here to sort of conclude is that when we're talking about God, okay, evidence for God, if you're talking about the first sense of evidence that I give, where you're deriving from your concept of God a set of predictions, nowhere do you derive from my concept of God. If we're taking a Christian monotheistic God, we're talking about a God that's all powerful, all knowing, all good. You can attribute other properties, depend like aseity and stuff, but the idea is that all those properties don't generate that you would see other minds. After all, God was not forced to create other minds. He could have just as well been content not creating. Okay, presumably it was a free action, in other words. Okay, so that's to say that your concept of God doesn't get you to there will be minds. So now you can't use that concept of evidence there. You're gonna have to use the other one if you're gonna make sense of evidence, but there's a problem with that, right? The other concept of evidence, the other sense of evidence that I was using, invoked past experiences. I think if I'm entertaining there was a horse in my bathroom, okay, I'm entertaining that there might be hair and hoof prints and feces all over my bathroom, right? If it was there, that's based on past experiences. But no one has any past experiences of God creating minds. That seems to be brought upon assumption, right? I mean, unless you can, verify that we've seen God create minds, which I don't think we can verify such a thing. I think that you can't use that sense of evidence either. So, in conclusion, there can't be evidence for God, and if there can't be evidence for God, minds don't count as evidence for God.
All right. Thank you both for those openings and rebuttals. Appreciate you both. All right. So now we're going to jump into the favorite part of every debate, which is the open discussion or cross-examination. So we have about a 40-minute cross-examination. Audience, as these guys are interacting, make sure you get your questions in because there will be a Q&A at the end of all of this. All right. So that's it. You two have the floor for 40 minutes.
All right, Danny, you stupid idiot. No, I'm kidding. That's a joke on Marlon. No, not going there at all. Yeah, so with predictions, I mean, I guess if you don't mind me kicking it off, just like as you said, to try to highlight our disagreement here, obviously when we're talking about a free agent, as you talked about, I agree God could have not created a universe at all and just remained in timeless, an eternal love relationship in the Trinity. So when we're talking about a free agent, I think predictions are it would be a weird way to go. I think you and I would probably agree when atheists insist that's the only kind of evidence you could have for God, that's kind of a non-starter, right? Because how could you possibly predict what a free agent would do?
And that's exactly, that's my view. There's a philosopher that I follow who basically puts it this way, that you can't falsifying an intentional state is hard to do because everything that you're looking at is consistent with some kind of the intentional state failing or some other intentional state succeeding. So we don't really think in terms of falsifying intentional states because, like, I know that sounds complicated, but I guess what I'm trying to say is something like, if you were wondering whether I wanted to drink water, okay? The fact that my water bottle is full does not falsify my desire for water. It could be that I'm failing, for instance, to drink the water. And so falsifying an intentional state like a desire or a belief it's an interesting challenge that is not true in falsifying specific material states or physical states, right? Because the notion of success or failure and competing desires and these such sorts of things are invoked, and there's all sorts of like consistency relations that you could account for, such that you couldn't really falsify a particular desire in a technical sense, right? But so I want to agree. I wanted to say that. I'm sorry, I might have cut you off, but what was
That's
that?
Okay. No.
Yeah.
Sure. No, I was just seeing if we agreed on that point. Because and then you talked about the reverse one, and you said we do have past experiences of horses doing things like leaving behind manure or hoof prints or something, but we don't necessarily have past experience of God creating minds. But of course, if my argument is successful, then it just does conclude that God is the explanation of our minds and would be the explanation of all the past minds that came before us.
Okay. So let me grant the argument for a second. Okay. If you're giving me an argument, right, then there's got to be some kind of necessity to it, because the idea is that you're using logical truths about the nature of mind, the nature of God, the nature of causation and explanation to derive your conclusion, right? But if it's an a priori argument, if it's a deductive argument, okay, then evidence just doesn't factor in at all, right? In other words, I could grant you that your argument to say that God necessarily explains our minds, but if the word necessary is there, right, that means it's deductive and there's a lot you've deduced a logical truth, okay? And if you're deducing a logical truth, evidence doesn't even come into the picture. It's like having evidence for the square, it's having evidence for a bachelor is a bachelor. That doesn't make any sense. You can just, it's the law of identity. It's necessarily true. It's a logical truth. Okay. So in other words, I could grant your argument, and I could be wrong about God explaining minds, right? But then I think you're out of the purview of evidence.
I don't think so. I mean, I think if you, for example, let's say you asked me, why is God necessary? I might be kind of stuck in a position where I have to say, well, that's just the definition of God, that he's just necessarily exists. And in that sense, it would be analogous to the married bachelor, right? Because we wouldn't say that someone not being married is a cause and then them being a bachelor is an effect, right? They're not these two separate events. It's just like, well, no, it's just they both kind of share a definition there. Whereas I'm not talking just the nature of God and its necessity. I'm saying that there is a cause, God, and then an effect, our minds, and the role of evidence would show, for example, the evidence you would agree with that our minds exist and are not merely the same thing as our brains. Because, for example, I think you would agree, like if someone could show that our minds just are our brains. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no. I didn't mean to interrupt. I arrived at deductively. I think that minds are necessarily non-natural, on my view. Okay. What I have not given evidence to anyone to accept that, right? I can only give an argument. You see, and maybe we're talking past each other, but a lot of people distinguish between argumentation and evidence, right? No one says that there's evidence for the square root of 9 being 3. No one says there's evidence that if A is B and B is C, therefore A is C. Evidence doesn't factor into the sort of conclusions, right? Evidence is an a posteriori concept, okay? And if it's a posteriori, it's I guess empirical in a sense, right? That you're using your experience and you're making an inference to an explanation. But if your argument is deductive, a priori, based on the meaning of God and the mind and the nature of the mind, the meaning of the mind, right? You talked about, I agree with you, first person, third person distinction. The notion of subjectivity and, qualia being yours and no one else's, that it can't be in principle in the third person point of view, right? I'm right there with you, but to me, these are all logical truths, okay? And so what I'm trying to say is that if you've come to your conclusion in a kind of a logical, philosophical manner, rather than in the way where how evidence works is that you look at a thing, you experience a thing, and then you come to a conclusion, right? Then if you're doing the former, I just think that suddenly evidence just doesn't matter anymore.
I mean, I think maybe to go back to something you said earlier, evidence certainly can be confirmatory, right? So like, I tend to agree with you, right? For like, to use an example Frank Turek uses, like if a neuroscientist is trying to say our minds are just the brain, well, he's actually presupposing he has a mind, because then he's looking at the evidence and making free choices to, interpret the evidence and say it brings him to one conclusion or the other. So I do tend to agree with you that a lot of the stuff is kind of just definitionally true. And evidence, I would say, is confirmatory of that. When we have evidence that, the mind causes changes in the brain, that it's confirmatory of that.
It's not any kind of confirmation. It's a posteriori confirmation, right?
Okay.
There's the kind of confirmation that A is C, given that A is B, that A is B and B is C, right? If I give a transitive property, right? A is B, B is C, and I can confirm that then therefore A is C, right? But that's not the same kind of confirmation that if I look in the bathroom and there's horsehair all over the floor, that I've confirmed there was a horse in my bathroom, right? That's a posteriori. That's understood in terms of predictions, induction, and evidence, right? And I'm just saying that I think that there's two ways I can go about this, right? And I think the way I've gone about it is that let me just grant you that God explains minds, okay? I'm saying that you can prove that in a philosophical manner, but the second that you do, you've taken the subject out of the a posteriori category, and so where evidence is in the a posteriori category, okay? And I'm saying that therefore there's a sense in which, okay, you proved that God explains minds, but that doesn't mean that minds are evidence for God.
Okay. So listen.
Go ahead.
Fair enough, but then this be no. Give your example. I'm sorry.
No. I interrupted you. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. No, it's okay. Well, so again, if I take evidence as reason to believe something, I think an example Joe Schmidt uses is, and I don't want to be guilty of bringing in another argument here, so I'm merely using it as an example.
I like arguments. Be guilty of that, please.
But he'll talk about the existence of moral agents is a reason to believe that a God exists over some kind of indifference principle, like atheism, right? Even if you can explain them on atheism, that doesn't seem at first glance to totally be compatible there. And likewise, I would say the existence of minds, even if I go with you and say, okay, fine, we just have minds by definition, right? Because in order to try to conclude anything other than we have minds, we'd be using our minds to do it. Okay, fine. But I would take the fact that we have minds as reason to believe there's a God out there, because he would create our minds. And I would take that to be evidence for God.
Okay, so you define evidence as reason to believe, okay? And I'm saying that that's a very watered definition of evidence, because it seems like that notion of evidence would apply to logical truths. Like, it's not like the premises are evidence for the conclusion when we're giving a transitivity law, right? So A is B, B is C, therefore A is C. There's no sense of evidence that really applies to that, although we have a reason to believe that A is C. And this seems like, to me, a terminological dispute between you and me, and terminological disputes are very boring, right? I can just adopt your definition of evidence. I'm just saying that the notion of evidence, as I understood it, is something like that, either that which the predictions that are generated from past experiences, so induction, right, or inference is the best explanation, that's got that kind of line of reasoning, or that which is predicted or expected given a proposition being true. I gave the horse example, right? There's a horse in my bathroom. I derive what I should see get in the bathroom, right? It's all a posteriori. Now, if you want to just use evidence in the sense that I have any reason to believe that God explains why we have minds, I'm fine with changing the topic to that.
Okay, well, I mean, look, I certainly don't want to be, you're certainly more, and I'm not just, this isn't empty flattery. You're certainly more philosophically astute than I am. I'm not, and so you could easily have definitions right. I could easily have definitions wrong. This is, I'm going off. I'm using Joe Schmidt's definition because he's a friend of mine. He's a good thinker. I admire him.
We'll just use
to me, I think some of the okay. Well, so maybe you could tell me where we disagree. Sure. So tell me where you disagree here then, because you've given the example. Well, can you repeat it? If A is B and B is C, then A is C. Is that the example?
Yeah. If I give a transitivity, if I say, Socrates is mortal, Socrates is human, humans are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal, I haven't talked about evidence. That's true. That's true.
Right.
The conclusion follows, right? And in fact, that we can say it's true that we have a valid argument, and it may be that there's no Socrates in the world, that there are no human beings in the world. That's going to be true, and that conclusion will be true across all possible worlds, right? And we have a reason to believe that. But notice we're not really talking about evidence, okay? And so I'm fine with saying we can change the topic to, do we have a reason to believe that God creates minds? And then you provided an argument where you're comparing a world with God and a world in which there's no foundational mind, right, and a world where there's a foundational mind, and we would predict that where if there's other non-foundational minds, it would have to be in a world where there's a foundational mind, right? That's what you want to say, right?
Yeah,
that's kind of like the essence of your argument. And so I'm having a hard time understanding why I should accept this, given that we've concluded that in my sense of evidence, the minds are not generated from the concept of a foundational mind, aka God, right? The idea is that there being minds and no minds is consistent with God's existence. So I guess if you could go over your argument another time, because I didn't really catch why I should have accepted one of these premises.
Okay, good. So a couple of things. So when we're talking about things that are true by definition, like Socrates is a man, a man is mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. These are things that are true by definition. I'm not my argument is not the form of A is B, B is C, therefore A is C. My argument is if A, then C, if B, then not C, C, therefore C is evidence for A, right? They're separate things. They're not just like the same part of one definition. Right? Okay. And so, for example, you say minds or no minds are consistent with God. Fair enough. But I wouldn't grant the inverse of that, which is both no minds and minds are consistent with no God. That's my argument.
That's our disagreement. That's our disagreement, right? Okay. So I want to know why. Okay, I want to know the first thing in your argument. I didn't really grasp it, so maybe this might help. Is it a deductive argument? Is it true? Is the conclusion necessarily true?
It's funny. I was wrestling with that in preparation, trying to figure out do I want to make this a deductive argument? Do I want to make it an abductive argument? And I promise I'm not trying to be squirmy here and avoid the question, because it was something I was genuinely wrestling with. As I was looking back over it after I'd written it down, it seemed that it was kind of an abductive argument, but in a way where it ruled out all the other possible explanations. And so I guess in that sense, you could say it's deductive, in the sense that I'm basically saying, here's A, B, and C as a possible explanation for D. B and C can't be explanations, therefore A must be the explanation.
Okay. So it doesn't seem to be necessarily true, which means that it's not, seems like it's going to be an inductive argument then. Right. And
I'm
abduction
okay with that. I do see...
Go ahead.
No, so it's okay. It's not as, I'm not saying, here's the thing. I'm open to, because again, I said at the beginning, I recognize that you're not a naturalist. So this isn't a dichotomy between theism and naturalism, right? I'm open to you providing some other explanation of how we can explain minds. And so you can say, in that sense, my argument is inductive because it doesn't rule that out. But in a sense, it's deductive in the sense that it does pose opposing mind hypotheses and non-mind hypotheses, and my argument is that no mind hypotheses can explain the existence of mind, and so what we are left with is the mind hypothesis.
Yeah, so let me be the first one to kind of level with you here. I think that it seems to be, I have this intuition that there is this explanation, and I really don't know. You're asking me, why is it that I have a mind? Why is it that you have a mind? You want to say God. And I'm like, look, it's a weird question. I don't have any clue. Okay. But I'm not ruling out, right, that there's a materialistic explanation, not a scientific one, right? Because I do know that the mental and the physical interacts, giving the alcohol example. I know that mentality interacts with the physical. There's a causal relation sometimes. Okay. And I can't say that it's impossible. It's impossible that the material world does somehow account for why we have minds, but albeit not in a law-like way, where there's natural laws about minds and and bodies and such. Okay, and that's what I mean by scientific theory, I suppose. But I'm right there with you. Like, if I were a theist, I'd be like, well, of course God explains this, right? But I'm just saying that if I don't see the necessity in God explaining the mind, because as long as it's possible for the physical and the mental to interact, or causally, and if it can interact causally, I don't see why it would be impossible that the physical can cause the non-natural mental, the mind, right? And as long as that's possible, I am agnostic, actually, to how exactly minds are come about. I think it's a weird question. It's kind of an existential angst of mine, right? And I'm jealous of you, right? Because it fits really well in the theistic framework, because it's on the theistic framework, especially Christian monotheism, everything is explained by God, right? The idea is that the physical world, the mental world that we are, the human beings, angels, God created all of these. Okay, but I take that to be kind of theological truth. I don't think that can be established philosophically.
I mean, and this might just be a disagreement between us. I mean, I would, rely on the work of guys much smarter than me, William Lane Craig, who have done the philosophical legwork in, providing philosophical evidences for this to be the case. And I guess, this would come down to a disagreement between us. I do see it, I mean, often people appeal to kind of like you are, that there could be potentially some way that the material creates consciousness. And so long as that's a possibility on the table, that's why I tried to give an argument for why that couldn't potentially be true. And so I guess what I would wonder from you, because, I have provided an explanation. I think I've argued for the explanation. I haven't just kind of asserted blankly, well, and naturalists haven't really given us an answer, so I'm just going to go with God because I'm already a Christian and that's what I believe. I think I've given a better argument for that. I guess here's a question I have for you. Maybe this can just serve as a clarifying question. How do you explain, if it is the case that the material is a sufficient and necessary explanation for our minds, how do you then make sense of mental causation?
Well, I don't. Okay. How is it that my mental state, let's say a desire to drink water, brings about the state in which I pick up the glass of water? I think that's going to be irreducible. There's not going to be a further. I mean, otherwise you get an infinite number of regress, an infinite regress, right, of explanations. There's going to be a point in which A causes B, and there's no further explanation. So, on my view, when my desire interacts with my body, there's not going to be a further explanation for why that happens, right? Otherwise, you just get an infinite regress of explanations, right? So, yes. I mean, I think it's kind of simple in that way. But I think that maybe this might clarify. Do you think it's impossible that your mind is explained by non-mental phenomena?
I don't know. I don't think that's possible.
You don't think it's impossible? Okay, so that means that there's a world in which your mind...
I'm sorry. Maybe I misunderstood. How did you ask that? Because I don't want to... Because it sounded like I said possible, and then you said impossible. So I want to make sure that we get this right before we go on.
Yeah, this might help our conversation. Do you think it's impossible that your mind is explained by non-mental phenomena?
Yes, I do think that is impossible.
Impossible. That means there's a contradiction on my view, right? There's a contradiction when I say that there's something wrong with my belief that it's possible that the mind is explained by some non-mental phenomena. Okay, and so I just don't see the contradiction. What's the contradiction in saying that my mind is explained by non-mental phenomena?
Well, I think the contradiction would lie in we'd be forced to conclude that certain attributes of our mind are illusory. And I think, so for example, free will. I think if our minds are reducible to brains and non-mental aspects of reality, then you can't have such a thing as free will. And if free will is indeed illusory, that results in a contradiction because we're having a conversation right now trying to freely decide what's the best explanation of minds.
I think you misunderstood my question, right? I'm
Oh,
saying
sorry.
I'm giving a cause-effect relation, right? Let me agree with you
Okay.
that if our mental states, like desires and beliefs, are reducible to physical states like brain states, free will goes out the window. I'm right there with you. High five. Okay. Where I'm not with you is that if a desire is caused by a physical state, that therefore that desire is not free. Okay. That because I mean that's where, because after all, right? If you were to I don't know, drink some caffeine, and that somehow explains why you desired to run 5 miles, right? I don't think your free will was violated. Although notice that we can explain what happened in
Sure.
terms of you drinking too much caffeine, which is a physical, non-mental phenomenon. Okay. So I just don't see a contradiction in saying that my mental phenomena is explained by not my mind, but sorry, that mentality is explained by non-mental phenomena like physical states.
Sure, but it wouldn't be solely explained by mind non-mental phenomena. Like the example you just gave, part of the
Mm-hmm.
explanation, yes, is in the drinking of the caffeine, and then part of the explanation is further in whatever that does to the chemical makeup of my brain, and then how that interacts with my desire to not run or not run. But that wouldn't be the fullness of the explanation. Part of the explanation would be I freely chose to run. And if likewise we tried to reduce that to more chemical states in the brain, like just the fact that caffeine molecules affected things and made me hyper, then that would negate free choice if all of it got reduced that way. But
Yeah, I
insofar as
agree with.
not all of it gets reduced, then you're not left with just a physical explanation.
Yeah, I'm right with you on the latter part. Once again, if somehow someone tells me that my desires are just a bunch of chemicals, right? I just think that destroys free will. I'm right there with you.
Cool.
What I'm wondering is that when you say your freedom explains, um, I'm wondering if that's even relevant, because I disagree with that. I don't think free will explains choices. I think choices are free in themselves. My view is that free will is constitutive of choice. Okay,
Well,
meaning that if
perhaps I
there's a
should have
choice,
rephrased it.
you're
Perhaps I should have just said my decision to do it is part of the explanation for why I do it.
yeah, but that's a non-explanation on my view. That's like saying I did it because I was free. You think if I do something that in terms of why I did that action rather than another, it's going to be that a good explanation will be the fact that I was free.
Not the fact that I was free, but the fact that I chose to, and built into that choice is freedom. So, for example, if
Okay.
there's a difference between a choice to run or not to run, and we're agreeing that the difference in the two choices cannot be something that's reduced to just physical brain states, then the explanation has to lie in something outside just physical brain states. And what is that going to be? Well, that's going to be my choice to either run or to not run.
No, it would just be my desire, my reason to run rather than not run. Look, this is what you're saying something like this to me. Are you saying that if you chose to do A rather than B, let's say you chose to run instead of swim, okay?
Okay.
You want to say that's explained by your free will. I'm saying that doesn't really explain anything. Rather, if let's say you said something like, well, I chose to run instead of swim because I didn't want to get wet. That is a explanation because it's contrastive. Okay? Because if you had chosen to swim rather than run, you would have invoked the same explanation that you were free. So on both hypotheticals, the hypothetical in which you ran and the hypothetical in which you swam, it can't be that the common factor, which is the fact that you were free in both cases, explains why you did one over the other.
Well, I would think that can be, because when you say something, when you say something like, I'm sorry, I have some words pre-programmed in my brain. I say them all the time and I don't need to. When you say what you just said, which is...
If they were pre-programmed, they were free, right?
No. When you say, I freely chose to run because I didn't want to get wet, right? The question is my desire to not get wet determining my choice. And if it's determining my choice, then we can't say it's free in any meaningful sense, which you and I both do want to affirm that it's free. Like, would we agree that it's possible that I could not want to get wet, but maybe I have another reason, like, but swimming is more fun and maybe it gets better exercise and builds your muscles more. And there I have desires pulling me in different directions. And I am an agent that is capable of evaluating those desires and then making a choice rather than saying something like Tom Jump would want to say, and we'd want to both want to disagree with him, which is, well, one of those desires at some point has to get 51% over the 49, and therefore it somehow determines your choice. Because it seems to me we're stuck with either saying, well, that determines the choice or the choice is free.
Okay, I'm gonna respond as quickly as I can because I'm scared that we're digressing into a conversation about the nature of free will.
Sure, fair enough.
But very briefly in response to you,
yeah.
very briefly, I just think that I don't take I understand determined. Every explanation is compatible with saying that something was determined, right? So if X explains Y, X determines Y. Okay. And so that's and if that's true, then there's a really big problem for the incompatibilists. I mean, specifically the libertarian free will, the metaphysical libertarian, okay, who thinks that what it means. Yeah, I'm putting my hand down for that one. I'm not
no, fair enough.
Okay,
yeah, you and I come to a disagreement there.
There could be a debate about that, and I'm scared. But the point is that I want to say that my reasons explain why I do one thing over another. And if it's the case that determined means explanation, then I'm determined to do A over B, but I was still free because I could have a different, my reasons could have weighed on differently on me in some other world or some other hypothetical. But that's compatibilism. I understand that you're not a compatibilist, and we could have a debate about that. If you want to respond to that, that's fine, but maybe we should get back to exactly. Yeah,
fair enough. I would just briefly want to make a point that you're not going to agree with, and I know a lot of compatibilists have a problem with me saying this. I don't see how that would be relevantly different from determinism, because if you said, well, in some other possible world, I could have had different desires that pulled me in a different direction. Well, we're not in that other possible world. We're in this possible world where you have the desires you have, and if those desires weren't up to you, if we go back to a materialistic explanation, if there's a materialistic explanation for your desires and they weren't up to you, then I don't think you're free in a meaningful sense. But maybe I'm
could respond. Okay, this is it's so juicy. Right, I love this topic.
Yeah, let's go ahead and get back on that.
It's a juicy topic. Cool. It's a juicy topic. So, yeah, go ahead. You go.
I mean, so I want to bring up something that might seem out of left field, although I did prepare to talk about it, and it might be something where you'd have a perspective that's very fresh to me and would inform me on some things. It might seem like it's radically off topic. I don't think so, because the kind of where we've come to the meat of our disagreement is you see it at least as a possible explanation that material reality could give rise to minds, and I don't see that as the case. And it would seem to me that if you were to argue that, then you couldn't have something like a mind detached from the brain, right? If the mind's explanation lies ultimately in materials, then the materials are the necessary explanation, right? And we've kind of gone over why I don't think mental causation makes sense in that context, but I would want to talk about near-death experiences and say that this at least provides an example where minds can have experiences that are not completely dependent on a brain. And therefore, if minds therefore aren't necessarily connected to a brain, then I don't see any reason to believe that the material could be a sufficient explanation for minds.
Okay, well, first of all, I'm right there with you. I don't think brains necessarily do anything, unless you're invoking a natural law. Okay, if there are no natural law of brains, there are natural laws of protons and electrons and quarks. I don't know anything about it, but the point is that you can reduce brains to those things, and there's laws about how those things behave, but there are no laws of brains. Okay, and because there are no laws of brains, there's no laws about mind, if it's the case that the brain so happens to cause a mind. Your question about disembodied minds, I'm inclined to think there are problems with disembodied minds. But I can be easily convinced if my problems can be met, but I think there are immaterial to the discussion. I can grant the coherence of disembodied minds for our debate. And so I'm if we're going back, did you want to try to tie what your question to the debate topic, or do you want me to try to?
Well, I mean, so I'll say what I think it is, and then maybe you can clarify if you think there's a better way of getting at it. To me, if we're saying it's possible that materialism can provide an adequate explanation with no mind attributes included at all for minds, then I don't see how material reality could give rise to a kind of mind that could then detach itself from that material, if that makes sense.
Oh, well, there would have to be, I don't see the contradiction. I mean, look, let's start from where we agree. So now we're back on topic. We agree that the mental states and physical states interact and cause each other. Mental states also cause other mental states, right? Okay. So it's not crazy to say that a physical state causes a mental state. Okay. And this is part of why I don't think it's crazy to think that physicality causes mentality. Okay. To me, I
don't think that's a crazy statement either. I agree with that statement.
Well, that to me, when someone is saying that the physical it explains the mind, to me, I'm just hearing physicality explains mentality. I'm just saying that if that happens, it's not governed by a natural law. Okay? Like, just like there are no laws of brains, there are no laws of bodies and minds. Okay? Woody from Toy Story had a mind, but presumably his body was plastic, right? And it was perfectly coherent to attribute a mind to Woody. Okay? No contradiction. Okay? There are no laws of what kind of body you must have to have a mind, right? After all,
I think. Sorry, I'm interrupting. Keep going.
No, go ahead.
No, I don't want to be the rude one. So I think there would be a contradiction if someone tried to give an ontology of how plastic could give rise to a mind inside of Woody. Like,
it's not going to be an interesting story.
Hold on.
It's just not going to be an interesting story. All they're going to say is something like, look, it's the case that this plastic state led to this mental state, and it didn't happen because of some natural law. That's the end of the story. There's no more extra how did that happen. There's no further mechanism.
Okay, so I think you and I agree. So that's a point I want to agree with, and I wasn't sure if we would, right? Because obviously, some naturalists would say, no, minds and our brains have to, they're two sides of the same coin, right? Something like that. You have to have them together. You're saying something that I actually agree with, right? Is that, well, minds aren't necessitated by the particular, say, brain structure we have. For example, then you couldn't have people born without brains that have consciousness. So you and I are agreeing there. So my argument is, okay, we have these immaterial minds, and they cannot be explained by just the plastic or just the brains. Therefore, the explanation has to be in something that has mental properties, because the plastic is not sufficient to explain the mind, nor is the brain state.
Can you repeat the last two sentences? Yeah, just the last two sentences. I heard. Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm saying we agree we have these immaterial minds, and they're not necessarily dependent on just brains, nor are they necessarily
dependent. Dependency relation is tricky. Dependency relation could, you could have dependency relations that they're non-causal. That gets tricky. Okay, so I'm saying that the brain can cause mental states. I think you agree to that. I'm saying there's no necessity with respect to that.
Okay, so yeah, we agree, and maybe part of this is maybe I'm misusing certain words like if cause or dependency. I want to be careful what I'm saying. I'm not saying, again, and I think I said this in my opening, of course I full on grant there are causal relationships between the brain and consciousness, right? What I'm saying is that is not the entire story. If the entirety of the story is all we have is brains, and that explains all of the consciousness, I'm saying that's what doesn't work. Right, and that's why I'm saying the mind can't be completely reducible to the brain. It can't be completely reducible to the plastic of Woody. Therefore, if Woody has a mind or we have a mind, the mind has to have an explanation elsewhere beyond just the plastic or the brain makeup.
But why, right? Why can't I just say, look, there's this physical state of the world that caused you to have a mind, end of story? I don't see a contradiction.
Because you would have to provide at least some potential mechanism for how that could happen.
Why?
It's like if you
Why
said,
should I?
well, I don't.
That's the end
It's
of
like,
the story.
well, no, it's like saying I don't see a contradiction between saying the rock just gives rise to water pouring from it. Right?
No,
I think we
but we're
intuitively
dealing with
recognize there has to be
mentality
something else
here.
behind the scenes.
Look, I just use a
Sure.
God example, right? Look, God, when God desired to for the universe to be to when he created ex nihilo, right? If some atheist, right, came in and says, "Well, what's the mechanism between God's desire and the material world following during creation?" Why should the theist care? Like, it's just very simple. Look, it's a very simple story, Mr. Atheist. The God spoke and God desired, and then voila, material world ex nihilo.
Yes.
No further mechanism. It's the same. Well, I don't see why the atheist can say the same thing. The non-naturalist atheist could say the exact same thing. You had a physical world, except it's backwards. Now you have the material world. Then suddenly you had a mind as a result, or from the state of that material world. Now it's not governed by natural laws, so it's non-natural causation, right? But nonetheless, you don't need a further component or further mechanism, aka God.
So I'm gonna give a reason for why I think you do, and I'm gonna use another example from Josh Rasmussen's book. So giving him the credit for the argument I'm about to make. So this is an area where I think the problem that we're trying to explain, right, the construction problem, has a way of disguising itself in our familiar experience, right? And so, for example, when you say, yes, God can just create the material world, which I'm an idealist, so that might take on a different form for me, but essentially, yes, because God possesses all the essential building blocks and the resources for building that material world. So you can have a direct one-to-one. But an example where a rock by itself does not possess all the necessary components to give rise to water. And so an example Josh Rasmussen gives is, suppose we're watching a cartoon, right? And we see the characters' mouths moving and sounds are coming out. And when we're so engrossed in the cartoon, because of our familiar experience of people talking and their mouths moving and making sounds, if we're so engrossed, we can be compelled to think, well, that the cartoon characters are actually making sounds. But then when we reflect on it, we go, oh, no, wait a minute. Pixels on a TV screen are insufficient to give rise to sounds. We realize there's something else going on behind the scenes because the resources for the sounds don't exist merely in the pixels. So when you give the example of God creating a universe, yes, you can have a one-to-one correlation there because all the resources for the universe lie in God. But when my whole argument here is that when we're trying to explain consciousness or minds, you don't have all the resources in just material reality. So there has to be something else going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, I guess Nate, we're running out of time, but to briefly respond in 40 seconds, my quickest response is something like, look, I'm just saying that could a physical state of the world have the same sort of necessary conditions such that, remember, necessary conditions is not the same thing as necessitates causally. Okay. So I want to distinguish that.
Okay.
The idea is that because God had the necessary conditions in order to bring about the universe, but it's not like the universe exists necessarily because of God. God could have not created. Okay. But I just don't understand why a physical state can maintain the exact same necessary conditions that are true of God, such that it brings about minds. I don't see a contradiction there, because I think what's apparent to me is that you nor I know those necessary conditions that are present in God such that minds exist. Nor do I know the necessary conditions that physicality possesses such that minds are in effect. But I think that's where I would conclude.
All right, guys, good stuff, man. Great discussion. And I knew I picked the right thing to allow you guys to have an open discussion, man. You guys are very cordial. You know, a couple of incidental interruptions, but that's probably due to the delay. Internet sucks sometimes like that. But I appreciate you guys for an open discussion.
Yeah.
So now we're going to transition to closing remarks, man. And once again, audience, if you have questions, get them in now, because once we start Q&A, I will only take the bundle of questions that I've been saving to the side so far. So make sure you get them in before the closing statements end. That said, Stelman, you're up for your 5-minute closing.
Sure. And seriously, thank you, Dan. Like I said at the beginning, it's been a pleasure getting to know you over the past couple of weeks. You know, I recently watched a debate my friend David Paulman had with, and I can't remember the guy's name, so maybe it's better, but the guy was so rude and then like pretended to get offended at the end when David Paulman like Marlon just said we had an incidental interruption, even though he had treated him so rudely. And those kind of discussions, there's a time and the place for them. Those are the kind of people you make an example of. But Danny, I would consider a friend, and is the kind of guy that I love to sit down and talk to, because I don't feel like I'm defensively like kind of defending my ideas. It's like I think we're building something new together. We're seeking truth together, and there's such great value in that. And even conversations we've had privately, he's changed my mind on some things, and so I definitely really appreciate that. I guess I don't have too much to say in closing. I do want to thank Josh Rasmussen not only for his work, but for exchanging some emails with me and helping me prepare. I want to thank David Paulman for helping me prepare. Inevitably, I'm going to forget a name here, which is going to make me feel bad. But my friend Daniel James Hole has spent countless hours with me writing, going through, pressing me on things I need to sharpen up and get better at. So I really do appreciate all the people that have helped me prepare for today. I guess two main things is Danny said he doesn't know the explanation of minds, but he doesn't see a contradiction saying that the brain could potentially produce minds. And I would say, listen, fair enough. I'm not going to demand that either and have an answer or you lose the debate. I wouldn't say something like that, but I do think I have provided an explanation, and it's not merely a God of the gaps argument. It's not just saying, well, Danny doesn't know, therefore I'm going to fill in the gap in our knowledge with God. No, I think I've given a good argument, good reasons to think that a foundational, necessary, independent mind is the explanation for why any contingent minds like ours exist. And in the absence of a better argument, I think that holds. And I guess I just disagree. I do see a serious problem with saying materials, anything that is any kind of non-mind aspects of reality are the wrong materials. Again, people can go back to my opening. I gave an argument for, again, intuitively we know no matter what materials we have access to build a robot, we'll never get first person awareness, qualia, or free will. And it just is, and maybe Danny can respond to this in his closing. It seems to me, I don't want to say a contradiction, but I don't know how you merge these two ideas together, where you say the mind isn't dependent on the brain because there's a coherence in a mind existing in a plastic toy. But then on the other hand, say it's a coherent idea for the mind to produce, for the brain to produce a mind. How can the brain produce something if it doesn't have any of the aspects that we're talking about, right? Nothing in physical reality has qualia, direct access, free will, or even an argument Danny likes to use, intentionality. That's a big one. I kind of left that out because I knew how heavily we agreed on it. And all of a sudden you give rise to this new thing, and then you could just pluck that new thing out. We could have talked about near-death experiences, stick it in a plastic toy. To me, that just, I don't see any reason to think that could be the case. I think my headphone is dying. That completely interrupted my train of thought. Sorry, my headphone just beeped. And I think I gave an argument for why certain constructions are impossible. And I think trying to construct first-person mental attributes out of purely third-person aspects of reality is an impossible construction. And I think a foundational mind hypothesis solves the problem. And so I'm willing to stand on the arguments I've made. And with that, I don't really know what more to talk about in my last minute, so I'll concede that we can give more time to questions.
All right, thank you so much, Stelman, for that closing remark. All right, Danny, you're up for your 5-minute closing.
All right. So very briefly in response, the idea is that when you have a cause effect, the properties of the effect don't need to show up in the properties of the cause, right? The idea is that if I strike a match and I cause something to burn into ashes, the ashes being the effect, right? The match is in the ashes don't share all of their properties. After all, they're not identical. Okay. And so, yes, it might be, and I mean, there are plenty of explanations that I think Stelman would accept. Alcohol causes me to have a certain qualitative experience, but the alcohol has none of those properties that my qualitative experiential state has, right? So it's not a problem to invoke an explanation or cause that possesses none of the qualities of the effect, okay? This is only a problem. I think Stelman's argument works towards people that are trying to identify a mental state and a brain state, or at least say that there's some kind of weird dependency, supervenient, emergent relation between the two, like H2O and clearness of water, right? I'm right there with you, Stelman, but I think that the properties of the effects can be radically different than the cause of the properties. And you can think of think of your argument in reverse. God caused the material world. The material world has very different properties than God's mind, right? But that's not a problem for God to cause that sort of effect, right? So it's not, I just don't see the issue there. But look, to be fair, this is not an easy conversation. Philosophy, the most of philosophy is done, and not in these short debate forums. They're fun, and I'm glad we're doing them, and people learn, and I enjoy it. This is a serious philosophical question that requires hours and hours of discussion, and maybe there might not even be agreement. But I'm glad to be here because I enjoy talking to people like Stelman. I really enjoy the topic, and maybe we could do more of this in the future. Please check me out on Phil Talk. It's with the red logo. Unfortunately, I named the channel after and I named it without looking at other channels. And there's another channel called Phil Talk, and they teach Tagalog, which is the language of the Philippines. So if you don't go there, I'll have to beat. They only have 1,000 subscribers. You're going to have to help me beat them. So my name comes up before theirs. But it's Phil Talk with a red logo with a P. Please subscribe if you like this sort of content. Thanks for having me.
All right, guys. Thank you so much for coming. Appreciate you guys. All right, great debate. Excellent job, guys. We're going to jump into this Q&A. We got some pretty good questions coming your way. Danny, they may be heavy you, buddy. So just be aware, man.
Okay.
Let me see all right, so this was coming your way. You'll see it pop up on the bottom of the screen. That is not what it was supposed to do. Stand by. It wasn't supposed to give you the all right, let me do it again. That's the one that's supposed to pop up. There it is. All right, so Danny, this question's for you. Danny, what would it take to persuade you there is a foundational mind that exists?
Oh, what a hard question. So let me just be very honest here. There are all sorts of things that can convince me of God. I think that's just a psychological question. Honestly, if I chose to go to church and have only Christian friends, and then there are people like Stelman, that might cause me to believe in God, right? Because I'm very much persuaded by societal pressures. Maybe I'm just like that. But there are all sorts of things that can convince me. If God, if I saw Jesus is real on the stars, that might convince me. But I think the interesting question is what serves as justification. Okay. What would cause me to believe or persuade me to believe might not be a good reason to believe. So I think actually William and Craig gives this distinction that we wanted to distinguish what's a good reason to believe and what would just persuade me to believe. And honestly, I really don't know myself to a point where I can tell you exactly what would persuade me. All I know is that I'm interested in the arguments and the philosophy of religion, and that might do something to make me a theist. I really don't know.
All right. Danny, Stelman, any thoughts?
Oh, no, I think that's a perfectly reasonable question. In fact, I was just talking to Joe Schmidt about this, funny enough. I know I've mentioned him a couple times, about there are certain arguments for the existence of God that I now reject because I don't think they're good arguments. And I look back at, well, why did I accept them in the first place? And maybe I just had certain biases to, well, of course I'm going to accept an argument for God because I already believe in him. And so that's kind of made me do a lot of kind of self-introspection of like, everybody has bias. You can't get out of it. If you pretend you're objective, you're just fooling yourself. But it's made me really kind of just look internally to, what should be a good reason versus, well, what just, because of my biases seems like a good reason. So I just think that's a good point everybody should consider.
All right. Next question is once again for you, Danny. Danny, if human thinking or mind is not evidence for the personal creator as an adequate source, how do you explain the observable facts?
just observations in general, like me seeing the screen right now? Is that kind of, do you think that was the aim of the question?
I'm
If
assuming, I
that's the
believe
correct
so.
interpretation, look, I think that if I were a theist, I would just say that everything, because everything was caused by God, right? That like everything kind of serves as a there's a sense in which everything sort of confirms God's existence, but I think that I explained why that might have been problematic because the idea is that God didn't have to create, so a world in which there's no universe and no observable observations or observable facts is just as consistent with a world in which there's, let me rephrase that. The idea is that whether there's something to observe or not to observe, that's consistent with God's existence, which is why I have a hard time with this notion of evidence as even being applicable to God. That's what I meant to say.
All right, Stillman, any thoughts?
No, not necessarily. I did have a thought, and it literally just left me. So if it comes back up, I'll let you know.
Okay, but we know we disagree. That's the.
No, I actually don't. There was something I wanted to clarify that was said earlier. That
okay.
it was bugging me as you were saying it, and it was kind of implicit in the question, but I just can't remember it now. Especially because I can't read the text, so I'm going to rely on Marlon to read me if any.
I had a hard time understanding the question. Sorry if I didn't. To whoever this person was, I don't know.
Oh, yeah, I know what it is, but it's not a question towards me, so it might be unfair for me to say it.
Yeah, I'll read it again, Stillman, just if you want to, if it helps you jog the memory. It says, if human thinking or mind is not evidence for the personal creator as adequate source, how do you explain its observable facts?
Yeah, so it really wasn't anything about the question. It was just about what Danny was saying. And I would just want to clarify something. When he says, if I was a theist, everything would be evidence for God. I know you're not doing this, Danny, but what I fear is that the audience might hear what some atheists do, which is kind of, this is just a lazy thing the theists are doing, which is, well, we're just going to say anything is evidence for God. I don't think everything is evidence for God. Granted, when we talk about physical things like trees, granted, I am an idealist, so I do think, for example, earlier when you said mental properties don't, or material properties don't exist in God, but He created them. Why don't they think there are such things as material properties? I think it is all mental properties. So in that
sense,
think
brains are material?
For God.
You don't think brains are
material? It depends on what you mean by material, right? Like I am a dual aspect idealist, right? So I do think there are dual aspects, but I think
I have that view as well.
Mind.
Yeah, I have that view as well. All right, so the idea is that when I say material, I'm talking about a particular aspect.
Yeah. So yeah, I think we agree there.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And here's another question for you, Danny. Is mind evidence that I exist?
Everything to him.
If an alien from another universe has a mind, does he exist? If there were evidence for the transcendental God's mind, would he exist? Thanks.
Okay. Can you repeat the question? I can barely see it on my screen. Could you repeat that one more time?
It says, Danny, is my mind evidence that I exist? If an alien from another universe has a mind, does he exist? If there were evidence from the transcendent God's mind, would he exist?
Okay, so this is a very good question. I think what this person's asking about is about self-knowledge. Okay? How do you know that you know things? How do you believe that you have beliefs? Right. And I would say that the way that you know that you exist is markedly different from any kind of inference and any kind of perception or empirical experience. Okay. The way that you come to know your own beliefs, on my view, is constitutive, which is a fancy word of built in, of having a belief in the first place. Okay. So when I say if I say I believe that it's raining outside, that is what's built into that belief is the belief that I believe that. Because I said I believe it. The fact that I said I believe it implies that I believe it. And that's called self-knowledge. It has nothing to do, on my view, with evidence, inferences, deduction, or argumentation. It's the weirdest kind of knowledge, I think. And that's how we come. We just know ourselves in virtue of, our knowledge of our beliefs being kind of constituted in a way where we have acquaintance with them and having those sort of beliefs about our beliefs.
All right, Stillman, any thoughts?
I think there's something interesting there when we bring in the alien, for example. Like I gave the example of a robot early on, and I mean, this kind of gets into the problem of other minds. Like if we looked at a robot, we would say, okay, it's exhibiting certain behaviors, but we don't think it's conscious. Well, how do we know other humans aren't like that? Well, because we assume other humans are like us. But if we saw an alien from another planet, well, why think the alien is like us and not like the robot? How would we know it's conscious? And I don't know if that's directly related, but I'm just saying I think that opens up some interesting discussion in that area.
It brings in something called the problem of other minds. Like how do we know? Like everything I'm seeing about Stelman and Marlin is that that's consistent with being explained by brains and not mentality, right? You could just be a pea zombie, a robot, a flesh robot. But so how do I know that you have a mind as opposed to just being a flesh robot? And that's called the problem of other minds. It's one of the hardest things to solve in philosophy. Good luck.
Yeah.
All right. And yeah, it's all you, Danny, man. I'm trying to find
That's fine. Stelman's been participating, so it's okay.
I'm trying to find one for Stillman, man. It's hard pushing around these parts. All right, so Danny, again, what is the atheistic explanation of the differences in the mindsets of humans and animals? What created that difference?
Very, very interesting question. Atheist philosophers, and philosophers of mind are very divided about this. My personal view is that humans have two faculties, the perspective faculty and the reflective faculty. And if animals have minds, which I'm actually starting to become more and more skeptical of, then they only have the perceptual faculty. They can't reflect, argue, deliberate, anything like that. All they are motivated by is what they see in front of them, and they acquire beliefs based on their moment-to-moment perception. But I can be convinced otherwise. I don't think there's any good. I don't think there's an easy view to all of the views about the distinction between animals and humans. All of them are either problematic or unintuitive. It's just a very difficult issue, however, very interesting.
All right, Stillman, any thoughts?
Yeah, I don't know that I would have any thoughts that would be particularly contributive to the discussion. Although, I mean, I think we're relevantly different from animals. I think we're creating the image of God. Animals aren't, but I do think we're both consciousness. And in fact, I heard Michael Jones the other day make an argument for why plants could even be conscious. I think it's interesting stuff, but I wouldn't have any sophisticated thoughts on it.
All right. And here's another question. Oh man, I'm thinking this is a question. This is about my system I'm using. Oh man, no. But I'll answer it. That's true. Do you use OBS over your streams? I'm thinking about stepping up from just using StreamYard, trying to decide what to start learning. Just because I made a mistake in picking my questions, I'll answer your question logical. No, I use what you call vMix, and vMix is a pretty good system. You can check it out online. I'm pretty satisfied with it, man. So check it out, man.
StreamYard is dope, though.
Well, yeah, StreamYard's solid. It's solid. I used to use StreamYard, but I stepped away from it. All right, and here's another question for Danny. If you believe God must be rejected as unfalsifiable, would you also accept that principle itself must be falsifiable, otherwise rejected, thus undercutting your own point?
Yeah, this is a very good objection against the logical positivist, the verificationist. Very good objection. Good thing is I'm not one. All I mean is that I have a strict meaning of falsification as applied to empirical or a posteriori conclusions, right? So falsification only applies to those sorts of conclusions. They don't apply to conclusions that have been made by philosophical means or argumentation, deduction, mathematical, or whatever, logical. So it's true that if I held to a falsification principle and just in general for all kinds of conclusions, I think it would be self-refute. There would be self-refutation. But I only apply falsification to things that exist concretely, empirical data, a posteriori truths.
Okay, Stillman, any thoughts?
No, I agree.
All right, and here's another question for you, Danny. Astronomers ask,
Well,
will
somebody's
we
got
know
to challenge me.
life? Yeah, that's what I was hoping so. I know I got a couple atheists in the live chat. I thought they would throw some questions at you, man, but I guess not. Danny, astronomers will ask, will we know life when we see it? If we found an alien without a body, but it is apparent, it's apparent it has a mind. Does it exist? If yes, God is spirit.
Okay, so will we know life when we see it? If we found an alien without a body, I just take aliens to have bodies. I mean, otherwise, I mean, okay, so I don't even know how to find a mind, to be honest, without a body. It seems like if you come to know a mind that has no body, it's omnipresent. It's everywhere. So it'd be like finding God. Aliens have bodies though, so that's where I'm kind of thrown off. Um, maybe I misunderstood the question. Um, Stelman, how did you interpret the question?
No, I think you're right. I mean, I think they're assuming, and I would take up for you here. I think they're assuming that potentially there could be something like the ghost of an alien floating around, and we could somehow see it and interact and be like, "Oh, look,
Okay.
a ghost! It must be a mind without a body." And I
Yeah,
would
but
take up for you
yeah,
and say, no, I don't think minds. For example, I referenced near-death experiences. I think minds can have experiences apart from the brain, but we wouldn't know about that unless those minds came back into their bodies and then reported to us what they saw. Because as just disembodied minds, they couldn't interact with the world.
yeah. I'm sorry if I misunderstood the question. It seems like this is like a common thing I'm doing is not understanding the question.
It's all good. It's all good, guys. That's actually the final question of the Q&A right there, man. So you guys did great, man. Great job. I know, Danny, you have a whole bunch of discussions with people on Discord, and you know you're not a stranger to this type of platform where you're having to have a discussion. Stillman, I know you have your channel. You don't have a whole bunch of discussions with different individuals that's opposed to you, but you did great, man. Both of you guys did a great job, man. I appreciate you both. And as always, I send out gifts, man. I send out gifts. That's just me. I like to send gifts out to people who come on the show and take time away from what they could be doing other than this. So it's just a token of appreciation from me to you, man. So I'll be reaching out to both of you once this show expires, man. And I thank you guys, man. Any final words before I shut this thing down?
No,
Thanks for having me.
Thank you very
I
much,
enjoyed
Ron,
it.
for the invitation. Oh, yeah, and thank you, Danny, for talking to me, man.
Thanks, Stelman. It was fun.
All right, guys. I'll be signing off, man. You guys take care and God bless you. All right.